Many of us will have heard the joke about the vicar in a devout Sunday school talking with the children and asking them if they can name a grey creature with a fluffy tail who eats nuts. And after some considerable silence, a child sticks up their hand and says, "I know the answer should be Jesus, but it sounds like a squirrel to me." Imagine a world where the presumption that the answer should be Jesus just isn't there. A world in which you might come up with all kinds of possibilities instead of giving the answer Jesus. The thought struck me very powerfully this week as I read Tom Holland's book Dominion. In his book, Tom Holland speaks of one who was the Son of God, whose birth set the order of things on a new course. War was over, the world stood as one. All this, so the inscriptions proclaimed to a grateful people, was euangelion, good news. But the subject of this good news was not Jesus, it was Augustus Caesar. So imagine the scene. Jesus is in Caesarea Philippi, an incredible place awash with the remains of worship to Syrian gods. Altars and temples are everywhere. Caesarea Philippi was also the centre for the worship of the god Pan. Even now it's called Banias, from its old name Panias. But of course 2,000 years ago, Caesarea Philippi was dedicated to the worship of the Emperor Caesar. And dominating the landscape was a massive white marble temple built to his honour and glory. Here it was, with all this religious paraphernalia and the trappings of state control, that Jesus, a penniless carpenter's son from an obscure northern village, asked his disciples who they thought that he was. Now we know that the answer should be Jesus, Yeshua, the God who saves, the Messiah. But frankly, this was a world in which the presumption that the answer should be Jesus just was not there. A world in which you might have come up with all kinds of possibilities instead of giving the answer Jesus. Like John the Baptist. They were cousins after all, and about the same age. There may have been some similarities despite John's more eccentric fashion choices. Or Elijah. Surely he was to come before the Messiah and help prepare the way. Or maybe Jesus was just another prophet. After all, in such a pluralistic society, it was easier to talk of Jesus as being one among many rather than attribute to him some kind of special status, a uniqueness which might devalue or demote the other objects of people's worship. But amazingly, Peter nails the answer. Jesus is the Christ, the chosen or anointed one, the Messiah. Peter's answer defied convention. It flew in the face of culture. It was not the obvious answer back then. Now, times change, and we change with them. From the 4th century under the Emperor Constantine, Christianity became much more mainstream. The church grew in status and in power. And pretty much up until the Enlightenment, certainly in the Western world, the answer to many people's question would have been Jesus. But the hiving off of religion to the private sphere, and then the growing pluralism of our contemporary world has meant that once again, the presumption that the answer should be Jesus just isn't there. So Jesus might turn to us and say, "Whom do people say that I am?" And if we're honest, we might say, well, most people haven't given it much thought. Still, some might say that you're a prophet, a wise teacher, a good person. Some might be more confused and think that you are a Brazilian footballer playing for Chelsea. And still some might conflate you with the church, which in the Western world in the 21st century doesn't always have the kind of reputation that we would be proud of. But here's the rub. When Jesus chose to have his conversation with the disciples in Caesarea Philippi, with all its symbols of power and objects of worship, he was launching something that would be deeply countercultural. Part of our mission, the great missiologist David Bosch once said, will be to challenge the hedonism around us, inculcating something of the spirit of being resident aliens in the world. If Jesus turns to you and says, "Who do you say that I am?" and you are willing to break with convention and say, "You're the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One," then you would be setting your face against the world. That is why Jesus went on to talk about suffering and about taking up our cross. As another missiologist, Mike Frost, reminds us, embracing a Christ-centered faith and lifestyle that are lived tenaciously and confidently right out in the open will require a dangerous departure from standard church practice. Yesterday we ordained 25 deacons in the diocese. Deacons are called to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ in word and in what they do. They are servants of the community, and they search out the poor and the weak, the sick and the lonely, and those who are oppressed and powerless, reaching into the forgotten corners of the world that the love of God may be made visible. They are agents of the counterculture, signs of God's loving purpose to restore all creation to himself through Jesus. But they do this against a backdrop of carelessness and indifference. They do this as a minority in an empire that is enslaved to the gods of wealth, power, sex, fame, and war, much as it was when Jesus gathered a few, mostly young people around himself and spoke of taking up the cross. We live in a world in which the answer is not obviously Jesus, a world in which Jesus is largely unknown. And the answer, therefore, is not to tell people about Jesus as if he were little more than a philosophical construct. The answer must also be to show people Jesus. Show Jesus to others in the quality of your love, in the graciousness of your forgiveness, in the self-sacrificing nature of your service, in the inextinguishable hope that you hold, that good is stronger than evil, that life and love will conquer death and fear. Show people Jesus so that he might become for others the answer that they need. Amen.